Right. Welcome, everyone. We'll let everybody come on in and get their seats. We'll start in just a few minutes. All right, well, let's go ahead and kick things off. We've got a lot of great material to share with you. I don't want to delay too much. My name is Dan Jolene. I wanted to welcome you to today's webinar sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration about separated bike lanes on higher speed roadways. We're going to talk a lot about a forthcoming toolkit and related guidance that you can use when your agency or your community is considering bicycle facilities on higher speed roadways, and those being roads marked 35 miles per hour or higher. We'll get into a lot of those details in a little while. We've got some details to share with you about some work that's gone into this and what you can expect to see from that toolkit when it comes out. We also have a presentation from a more recent study that established some crash modification factors or safety effectiveness information for separated bike lanes of all types, not on separate higher speed roads specifically, but we have folks from the research team here to share those results with you. So we'll talk all about separated bike lanes today. We have plenty of time at the end of the presentations for a discussion period to make sure we answer your questions. I have a little bit of housekeeping, some introductions that I want to get into, and then we'll roll right into the presentations. In terms of housekeeping, you all as attendees won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you can submit questions as we go along. There's a questions pane within the Zoom webinar platform. We hope you'll be able to send in questions as you have them. And again, we're saving about 30 minutes at the end to answer those. We're archiving the webinar today, both in terms of the slides that we'll make available to you, as well as a recording. We're going to post all of that on our website. If you go to pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, you'll find it there. I'll share some links out in the chat shortly where you can find that information that we've posted already. We are providing certificates, professional development credits for this webinar. How you'll get those is by completing a post-webinar survey for us. So we'll link that in the chat later on. We'll send a follow-up email tomorrow with information about the archive page and how to get those certificates. So it'll all be, coming to you right to your inbox. We'd encourage you to review previous episodes, webinars that we've had, and look out for the ones that we're going to be scheduling coming up in the future. I want to go through some introductions so you get to know our panelists a little bit and who you're going to be hearing from. First, we're joined by Darren Buck, who is the Pedestrian and Bicycle Program Coordinator at the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Human Environment. He oversees a variety of projects to research and promote safe, comfortable, and complete networks for bicycle and pedestrian travel. Prior to this role, Darren managed the Complete Streets program in the city of Alexandria, Virginia, and was a bicycle and bike share planner at the DC Department of Transportation. So we're excited to have Darren joining us today. We're also joined by Dr. Karen Dixon, who's a senior research engineer and associate agency director at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. Her research focuses on the safety aspects of transportation engineering and roadway design, with an emphasis on designing safe roads for all users. Karen is currently the chair of the TRB Safety Performance and Analysis ACS 20 committee. We're delighted to have Karen with us today. We're also joined by Connor Simler, who is a principal planner with Kittleson and Associates in Boston and was the lead researcher for the FHWA Toolkit Guide for separated bike lanes on high-speed roads that you'll be hearing about today. Connor's been at the forefront of bicycle facility planning and design, leading research for FHWA, NCHRP, and NACDO. He contributed to the development of the NACDO Urban Bikeway Design Guide and the FHWA Separated Bike Lane Planning and Design Guide, among others. So I'm excited to have this panel join us today. We are going to start with some opening remarks and introduction from Darren Buck from the Federal Highway Administration. Darren, you're all set whenever you're ready.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you everybody for being here. We're really excited about this presentation because both of these products we have been a long time coming. I wanted to talk a little bit about the genesis for the second half of our presentation, the project that I helped oversee about separated bike lanes on higher speed roadways. Back in 2019, our colleagues over at the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, produced a very good bicycle safety research report that theorized that separated bike lanes were safer for crash type that they identified as being disproportionately harmful. And it's not hard to imagine that on higher speed roadways, people on bikes being hit from behind by motor vehicles is a particularly severe crash scenario. And they theorized separated bike lanes could help that. And that sort of planted a seed with us to say that is not a context where a lot of separated bike lanes are being implemented now. We see a lot of side paths, we see other solutions, and oftentimes we just simply don't see any bicycling facilities on those major arterials that increasingly are serving as the main streets for suburban and exurban communities, with more and more people, and particularly more and more people in lower income spectrums being pushed out of more urban settings, and the phenomenon of suburbanization of poverty, the disproportionate fatality crisis in those contexts among people who have been historically underserved by the transportation system. We thought that this was an important topic to try and address and see how bicycling facilities in that context are being used and how they could be used. As we were working on this, we knew that our colleagues over in Turner Fairbanks Highway Research Center, along with the Texas Transportation Institute, were working on a huge wide-ranging study on the actual demonstrated safety effects of separated bike lanes. And it just so happens that they posted their first initial synopsis of the results of that study around the same time as we are in the process of finalizing our report. And we thought it was a very good time to combine both of those, to talk about separated bike lanes, to talk about the demonstrated safety benefits that we see from that TTI study that Karen's going to tell you about, and then translate and turn the corner and begin asking the questions of how do we begin to bring those safety benefits to these communities where we do see roadways that are unfriendly for bicycling, that are experiencing a disproportionate share of those bicycling fatalities because of the way the streets work there. So thank you all for coming. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank all of the technical reviewers on both of our projects, the separated bike lanes on higher speed roadways and the separated bike lane crash modification factor study, as well as the 14 state DOTs that participate in our Fostering Innovation in Pedestrian and Bicycle Transportation Pooled Fund study that funded the work on the latter resource. We hope this begins a good dialogue on the role of separated bike lanes within a larger transportation network, and getting safe, connected, and comfortable networks for everybody who wishes to ride a bicycle to all communities. And with that, I will throw it back to Dan.
Aaron, thank you very much for that introduction. Perfect way to queue up our next two presentations. So I'd like to ask Karen Dixon from the Texas A&M Transportation Institute to go right ahead whenever you're ready. You can pull up your slides and we'll get right into that CMF study. Just a reminder, as Karen is pulling up the slides, that you all have the ability to send in those questions. I imagine you'll have some, so that questions pane, just go ahead and locate that if you haven't already.
Can you see my slides?
Not yet, Karen, I'm sorry. Let's see. There's that share screen tray at the bottom there. That might do it if you
can.
Okay.
Okay.
Here we go. All right, we've got it now.
How's that?
Perfect. All right, thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to first acknowledge Ann Doe, who was our FHWA she oversaw the research that we did on this project, and she was very important to the process. So we really appreciated the contributions you gave to the project. As they already said, my name is Karen Dixon, but I was also teamed with two of our key researchers here at TTI, Mariam Musavi, and then Raul Avalar, who unfortunately for us is now no longer at TTI. He took an Insurance Institute position, but he was very important to the project as well. So in the United States, over 800, almost 850 bicycle crashes occurred, bicycle fatalities occurred in 2019 that were determined to be roadway related crashes. So we felt like it was important to set this as a priority, to analyze and find some way to enhance safety. So to determine that, we decided that it would be a good idea to try and pursue maybe evaluating separated bicycle lanes, which was the beginning of the project, is to evaluate separated bicycle lanes. But once we started collecting data, it would seem it was silly if we were looking at a bicycle lane facility and it didn't have separate, it wasn't separated, but we still had the bicycle lane information. So we went ahead and compiled a database that included more than just separated bicycle lane and what we call base conditions. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So if you're not familiar with what we're referring to as a separated bicycle lane, or we call it an SBL throughout this presentation, it's basically bicycle lanes that are separated with from adjacent vehicles with some sort of buffer area, but then there's also some vertical element. And here in this photo, you can see they have flexi posts, but it could be some other vertical elements. Some are rigid, some are not rigid vertical elements. Some places it's a barrier, it's just a variety of these treatments. And sometimes you even have a transition from one to the other. And so we tried to catch that as well when it occurred. So our big question was, how safe are separated bicycle lanes? And this is something we actually had looked at a couple of years before we started the study. And at that time, we were just now getting a decent supply built. So we really didn't have a large enough sample size. So we felt like as soon as the sample size started increasing, and this of course was coincided with when states started adopting them and building them, that it would be time to go ahead and explore this again. So it seemed like it was a key time to go ahead and start looking at safer bicycle lanes and determine if we could at least get a handle on how safe they might be. The Highway Safety Manual uses a term called crash modification factors. And these crash modification factors are an estimate of how many crashes you'll have with the treatment versus how many crashes you have without the treatment. So your goal is that CMF would have a value that's less than 1. That means you would have improvement if you put in a treatment. If you had a value that was greater than 1, then that would be something that you're probably not wanting to deploy as a safety treatment. And so our goal was to try and figure out what the CMFs are. Hopefully they'd be less than 1. Hopefully they would be substantially less than 1, but the data and analysis would tell. So the thing that we did notice is that with the increasing number of bicycles, you have to think about the increasing number of crashes. And one of the things that has been problematic during the study is the way that some agencies report crashes. We recognize that probably bicycles and their crashes were underreported for a variety of reasons. Probably the main one is if you have a bicycle crash between a motor vehicle and a bicycle, then life-saving efforts are probably your priority, not writing down a crash report and making sure that it gets recorded. So we try to be careful in recognizing that this is just a starting point and that there will be more information to come as we get our infrastructure of bicycles further developed. So to begin this analysis, we did need to have bicycle exposure. It's a critical variable for models, just like ADT is for when we're designing our roads. We felt that bicycle needed to be included. So ideally, we wanted to have annual average daily bicycles or average daily bicycles if we could get that. But unfortunately, this is not something that's widely collected. So we had to figure out how we were going to do these exposure analyses, have some way to populate that part of the database. Ultimately, we ended up using some surrogate variables and doing a prediction on exposure models. The reason we had to do that is we were first going to go out and we had this wonderful phase 1 plan where we were going to go and collect data manually for a variety of locations that had these facilities, and then we would extrapolate information from them. But the timing of that was spring of 2020. And we all know what happened then. COVID hit. Now all our plans had to change. So we immediately changed our approach to the project. And instead, we looked at what cities did have data, recognizing it probably wouldn't be as robust as it would have if it was complemented with other data. And we found that the 5 cities, Austin, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Denver, Colorado, San Francisco, and Seattle, all had some data that we could work with, that we could use to try and extrapolate for exposure. To get site features, we then used primarily Google Street View. Because it was the COVID era, what we were able to do is repurpose some of our researchers to drive Street View on a ton of roads that had bicycle facilities and collect a variety of characteristics so that we could also use that for identifying road features. So we developed the exposure models, and then of course, ultimately that meant we could use that information to develop the CMFs. So the team reviewed, as I mentioned earlier, 5 study locations. When we started looking at the characteristics of those locations, we were trying to take a look at the data that was presented at at all 5 locations. And we wanted to set some data aside to determine how good the estimates were. And so we set Austin and Denver aside, primarily because they were both in the process of adding more of these facilities. And we also noticed when we compared the data to traditional data that, they looked a little different, especially Denver. For something was a little different in Denver. And so we set those 2 aside and used those for validation at the end of the project. So that left us with Cambridge, Seattle, and San Francisco as the 3 that we focused our analysis on. The site features that we primarily collected using the Street View included things like whether the roadway was 1-way or 2-way, what the bicycle lane was it 1-way or 2-way? Was it on one side of the road only, on both sides of the road? We try to get that sort of information. We try to determine, is it near an intersection? If so, what are the characteristics of the intersection? Did it have parking? And if so, what type of parking? Were there other bicycle facilities if it didn't have separated bicycle lanes, and what did they look like? When you had the bicycle lane, thing that we felt probably was a critical one is what that buffer distance was between the motor vehicles and the bicycles. We had to try and measure that in Street View, which was probably not as precise as we would have liked, but still gave us some idea of if it was a large enough buffer or kind of a narrow buffer. We excluded sharrows and shared use paths from the analysis. That neither of them quite fit the term for separate bicycle lanes. If they were also intersecting our separate bicycle lanes, we tried to avoid those locations as well. We were just trying to not confound our data with curious additional information. An interesting variable that we started collecting, and I think that it needs a little more attention, is continuity of the facility. And when you're thinking about bicycle lanes, sometimes the road's been widened and they put the bicycle lanes in because they've widened the road at one section, but then maybe it ends and they narrow it down and the bicycle lane goes away. And we were seeing that when you have a lack of bicycle or facility continuity, that seems to, of course, as you would expect, be detrimental to the functionality of the facility. And so that was a variable that we looked at. We tried to avoid picking sites that didn't have continuity. That was our goal. That's why I said kind of later added it in. We also looked at the distance to the nearest bicycle facility. And what I mean by that is we were trying to use an analysis for comparative purposes. So we were using cross-sectional analysis. And so what we did is we selected shared use, separate bicycle locations. And then we said, well, where's the nearest separated bicycle lane? And where's the nearest road that doesn't have a separate bicycle lane? What is the distance to those? Because if you don't have bicycle facilities, then the bicycle may go either way to take a different route. So we're just trying to get an idea about how convenient the route was for the cyclists. So to develop the exposure models, we used, as I mentioned earlier, data from Cambridge and San Francisco and Seattle, and we used a variety of information based on, of course, what they had available. Some had permanent count information, some had temporary count information. I think that this is something that, more research is going on now about how you can develop exposure models for these facilities. And so I'm eager to see, as we go forward, how those will change. But this is just kind of a snapshot of what we did to try and estimate it. So the study design, we conducted cross-sectional analysis for mid-block locations. And what I mean by mid-block locations is locations that weren't within 200 to 250 feet of the intersection, because those would be separated as intersection location crashes, and we tried to model those separately. We also tried another characteristic, which we called corridor models, which was both the mid-block and the intersections, but that one also, there was just so much variability in the data that one didn't work out. So ultimately, we considered the separated bicycle lanes as our treated sites, and then we looked at comparison sites without the separate bicycle lanes. The base condition was a traditional bicycle lane. So that was something that we had to think about. When you're trying to figure out what your base condition is, obviously we're going to compare it to the separate bicycle lane. Some said, well, why don't you have your base condition be no bicycle lane? Well, that wasn't our initial goal. Our initial goal was to try and figure out what are people doing to enhance their facility. So we thought, well, let's say that at least they bought into the idea they have to have a bicycle lane. And then of course, the next step would be a buffered lane, and then ultimately it'd be a separated bicycle lane. So that was our thought process in using the base condition as a traditional bicycle lane. Though, because we were looking at the distance to other bicycle facilities, we did have sites in here that had no bicycle lane, and ultimately we did include it in the analysis after all. So the evaluation to compare the treated and the untreated was something that's called a propensity scoring method, and it tells you what's different between your site and the sites you're evaluating. And so that was one of the statistical approaches that we used. And then, of course, if we had values of 0 for traffic volumes, and some databases had values of 0 for traffic volumes, we actually had to just throw those sites out, because I don't think the facility would be built and then no one would use it. And so unfortunately, that would probably mean there was an error in the data. So that was just kind of a housekeeping issue that we had to resolve. So the CMF estimation, we had the dependent variables that had multiple scenarios, including the separate bicycle lane, the traditional bicycle lane, et cetera. We tried several different approaches. We used a single parameter estimate, it did not work. Ultimately, we used a linear combination of coefficients, and that was the basis for our development of models. I will say that Raul Avalar was instrumental in this particular step. So kind of basic condition, we had a couple. We had traditional, but we also wanted, since we had a lot of buffered sites, we wanted to compare those two. The separated bicycle lane, we had primarily, once we looked at the data that we had acquired, most of them landed in the category of either flexi posts or some sort of bollard that's flexible and blended. And blended would again be primarily transition zones, or where they transition from a flexi post to maybe a rigid treatment or something. So if you're thinking, well, I still don't really quite get the picture of what these facilities look like, here's a snapshot of the 4 facility types. The painted bicycle lanes with no buffer is up at the top. That's a traditional bicycle lane. You can see a common problem we have with these facilities is in the fall, leaves accumulate. So you have to do good maintenance with these facilities, of course. You can see that the painted bicycle lanes with the buffer is the upper right-hand corner. And then with separate bicycle lanes in the lower left, it's flexi posts, and the lower right is the blended, where you can see they're transitioning from flexi posts to a location that had green lines and up to approaching an intersection in that particular location. So this is the final list of CMFs. This final column shows you the suggested CMFs. It's a lot to take in one graph. And so, we'll probably reduce it down pretty quick, but the thing we're looking at is, what is the baseline condition, the separated bicycle lane compared to the traditional bicycle lane, or compared to, say the blended type treatment. And so we can kind of scroll down through here and take a look at what the baseline condition was and the treatment that we were comparing it to. So when the CMF tests results were finished, remember I said we held back 2 sets of data for validation. We went to get the Austin and the Denver data to see what the validation looked like. The Austin data did validate by statistically determining that there was no statistical difference, which tells us it's equivalent, relatively equivalent. The Denver data didn't do so well. We couldn't statistically exclude it from being equivalent, but we didn't, have as good a fit as we would have liked. I'm not quite sure why that is. You can think of a lot of reasons why that might be. It could be the climate. It could be the higher elevation. It could be, there were some sites in the database that we had that didn't have much variability. So, it seemed like most of the sites had common characteristics, and so maybe lack of variability could have had something to do with it. We don't know, but that is an interesting question that probably deserves some future research. So this is kind of just in a nutshell, a summary of that larger table with the graphics to try and simplify it based on the significance level. And the CMF, of course, and this one is this second to the last column over here to the right. You'll see, for example, if you're looking at the significance level of 0.01, just as an example, and we wanted to compare the separated bicycle lane with the flexi posts, and you compare that to the traditional or the flush buffered bicycle lane, that CMF is a 0.468. So remember I said a CMF of 1 or less is something that we were striving for. So all of these look pretty good as far as that goes. And even changing the significance level, they all look pretty reasonable. So we were pleased with those results. Just kind of as a quick example, just to think about what that means. If you had a segment road that the traditional bicycle lane had 20 bicycle related crashes each year, and you converted the bicycle lane, the traditional bicycle lane to the separate bicycle lane, what that tells us is that 20 crashes per year, you multiply the CMF times that means you'd have basically 10 crashes per year after the treatment and things have settled down. So that is reducing the number of crashes by about 50%, which is a phenomenal number. So we were real pleased with that, even with the citation of certain things that if we went back to look at it, we would test differently because things have changed and more of these have been built. I still think that this tells us that we can confidently say that this is a treatment that's going to be serving the population well. So just in summary, the CMFs for separate bicycle lanes, when you compare them to the traditional bicycle lane, do have a reduction in crashes as much as 50%, we saw. The most effective one were treatments with FlexiPost treatments and the blended treatments. I did not put all of the models we developed on our graphic here, but we did try some others. The research team acquired data from 3 locations and then applied it to 2 additional locations. And the team assessed the prospect of using intersection only and corridor type, but those didn't really work statistically. So I do think that there's still room for those to be evaluated. I like the idea of doing the corridor analysis. I still like that idea. I think that, as we evolve a little bit and the corridors have more length to them, so they're more stable, we'll have a little better chance of understanding their implications. So I think we're going to have questions held till the end, if I'm not mistaken. So I think with that, I'll conclude. And I appreciate your attention.
Thanks so much, Karen. That was excellent. We already have quite a few questions coming in, so hopefully we'll have a chance to get to some of those later. I did send out a link to a research tech brief available from FHWA that covers some more detail and some of what you just heard from the presentation. So you'll have that too. Let's go ahead and transition to the next presentation. And this is the one where we'll be focusing on these higher speed conditions, higher speed roadways and separated bike lanes and how they work there. So Connor Simler, you are all set to go. We have your slides and whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Karen. That's really exciting to see some of those results. We've been waiting on these for a long time as an industry, and really, really promising early findings. And your presentation transitions very nicely into our topic for today, which is research that we did with FHWA on separated bike lanes on higher speed roadways. So we've prepared a brief presentation for today. I'm going to go over some of the background of the project, who was involved, what the research was trying to accomplish, what we found in the literature review and in conversations with agencies that are practicing designing and deploying high-speed separated bike lane applications, a little bit of a sneak peek of the toolkit guide, and then finally a couple of case studies just to share some examples from what we've learned. As I mentioned, the research was led by Federal Highway Administration. Darren Buck and Bernadette DuPont represented FHWA on the project leadership team. And the contracting team was led by Kittleson Associates with myself and some of my colleagues, Nick Foster, Caitlin Schaefer, and John Hicks. And Dangeline, who you've been hearing from today, was a key member of the research team as well from UNC Highway Safety Research Center. Like any good research effort, we were led by a stakeholder committee of experts in the industry. Our stakeholder committee was comprised of individuals with experience and insights into separated bike lanes at all levels, and especially those that have tried them at higher speeds. We had 5 state DOTs, 4 cities, one county, and NACDO also participated. To set the stage with some context, we thought it'd be helpful to remind ourselves where we are at this time with our roadway safety and some of the key milestones and events that have taken place. So first, a couple of years ago, US DOT released the National Roadway Safety Strategy in response to the concerning increase in crashes and fatalities on our streets by all roadway users, and especially vulnerable road users, people walking and biking on our streets. The roadway safety strategy outlined a comprehensive approach to reducing serious injuries and deaths on the country's streets. This is informed by a number of things, including a 2019 NTSB paper that found that 45% of mid-block bicyclist deaths were resulting from drivers overtaking bicyclists, the type of crash that would be significantly, or at least it could be assumed would be significantly helped by providing separation between those users. Also, importantly, the bikeway selection guide, FHWA's bikeway selection guide, identifies a need for separated bike lanes or shared use paths for any streets with speeds above 30 miles per hour, and even at lower speeds if traffic volumes are high enough. Which means that to design a street safely for people walking and biking, for people biking, we are looking to design shared use paths or separated bike lanes on all high-speed roads. Though, as you know, there aren't a lot of applications of separated bike lanes on high-speed roads yet. So that's where the need for this research comes in. And then finally, as you just heard from Karen, the latest research on separated bike lanes shows that adding them to streets, even with existing bike facilities, significantly reduces the severity and likelihood of crashes involving bicyclists. So just to set a couple of parameters around what we did, the objective of the guide was to develop, the objective of the research was to develop a toolkit guide for designing and implementing separated bike lanes on higher speed roads, which we defined in the research as roads 40 miles per hour or greater. The research itself involved a comprehensive literature review, which synthesized what we do know about separated bike lanes and their performance on safety and usage. We looked to our partner agencies, our agencies around the country, to understand what were the best practices for policies, planning, and design. What were the obstacles preventing the deployment of separated bike lanes on higher speed roads? We tried to document as many case studies as we could, recognizing that they are limited, but there are some that led significant insight into this research. And finally, the toolkit guide is not intended to be a detailed design guide. There are numerous other resources that provide the information that you might be looking for those detailed design guidance, but what are the features and factors that need to come into consideration, especially on higher speed applications? Karen covered this already, but the definition of separated bike lanes is that it is a space in or adjacent to the street that is intended exclusively for the use of people riding bicycles or scooters as they are becoming more prevalent. That they are separated from bicyclists, separated from traffic and people walking horizontally, and that also there is some element of a vertical separation that can vary in its manifestation, but it has to exist at some level to be considered a separated bike lane. So to summarize the work, we found that higher speeds are in fact a risk factor for more severe and more frequent bicyclist crashes and injuries. That the separated bike lanes, as we just talked about, do have an impact on safety in a positive direction. They do reduce the likelihood and severity of crashes for people biking. And indeed, they improve safety for all modes. Separated bike lanes influence the behavior of people driving by decreasing speed, proximity, and instance of motor vehicle encroachment on the bicycling space. And then finally, everyone feels more comfortable on streets with separated bike lanes, whether they're driving, biking, or walking. The sense of order that separated bike lanes provide to people using our street system has a tangible benefit to the way they perceive the roads. However, with all that in mind, we did find that there has not been much research that's focused on the application of separated bike lanes on higher speed roadways, and that's where we tried to fill the gap in this research. So I mentioned already that the research team conducted an exhaustive literature review to try to understand the safety performance of separated bike lanes in all conditions, as well as the safety performance of higher speed roads with or without the prevalence of bike lanes. And we leaned heavily on the vast and growing library of design guidance from across the country. As you are probably well aware, there is research and guidance coming out of AASHTO, as well as FHWA, NACTO, ITE, and our state and local planning and design agencies. Many of these resources point in similar directions. They draw from the same pool of knowledge that we continue to draw from, that is the experience and practice in the United States, as well as research coming out of NCHRP and FHWA. So the other component that this research included was in addition to drawing from the experience and knowledge of our stakeholder committee, we conducted a peer exchange of agencies that have applied separated bike lane designs on higher speed roads. So participants in the peer exchange included all of the stakeholder committee members, as well as representatives from Los Angeles Department of Transportation, the City of San Diego, SANDAG, the MPO in the San Diego region, the City of St. Paul, Michigan DOT, and the City of Modesto, California. So following up on the literature review and the peer exchange, what we found was there's 4 key challenges. First, there's a lack of guidance on what implementation on higher speed roads should look like, including what is the most appropriate buffer distance and what is the most appropriate type of vertical element for those contexts. Second, agencies expressed continuing concern around maintenance for bicycle facilities. That is common to all speed contexts, but at higher speeds, there is a greater chance of a more severe damage to the vertical element and also the debris component that can occur on higher speed roads. There are continue to be considerations for driveways and intersections like we have at lower speeds, but at higher speeds, those conflicts can be potentially more severe and more concerning. So agencies are looking for guidance on how to treat those conditions. And then finally, as I said already, there aren't as many separated bike lane installations on higher speed roads. And so we don't have a wealth of data and experience to draw from like we do at other in other contexts, which is, of course, where we were maybe 10 or 15 years ago with conventional separated bike lanes in the US. And so I anticipate that over time, we'll see more applications and we'll continue to learn and evolve from those designs. This brings us to the toolkit guide itself. The toolkit guide, which is close to being finalized and should be published in the near future, or at least the final report submitted to FHWA in the near future. The guide is broken up into 3 primary components. First is planning. What needs to happen to enable the deployment of separated bike lanes? What are the funding options and how can they be applied? What supportive policies might be necessary to help agencies promote and expand their network of separated bike lanes on high-speed roads? And of course, what are some best practices through public outreach? The second component is design, and that is getting into some of the specific details, like what form of separation are you going to use? Determining the directional and width characteristics. Is it going to be a one-way separated bike lane on both sides of the road or a two-way separated bike lane on one side? How wide does the bike lane need to be? How wide does the buffer space need to be? And then thinking about conflict points. How are we going to design and manage conflicts at driveways and intersections? And then finally, maintenance. We need to be considering in the design and planning and design process, considering how we're going to deal with stormwater management. What is the plan for street sweeping, for snow clearing, and other maintenance procedures? Karen alluded to the issue of foliage, of falling leaves in the fall season. Need to make sure that there's a plan to keep those separated bike lanes clear, especially during those seasons, and recognizing that on higher speed roads, it may be even less desirable or sometimes impossible for a cyclist to move out of the separated bike lane to get around something. So just zooming in on planning for a moment, the chapter on planning talks about a few topics. First is justifying the project. So the toolkit guide assumes that you have come to the guide with already the understanding that this is the right application for you. We're not hoping to make the case for applying a separated bike lane on any high-speed road. There should be a specific need, either for a safety purpose or a network need, that there should be opportunities to leverage planned projects. And as we'll talk about in a moment, the higher speed roads do call for more robust implementation, which may require more cost and more time. And then, of course, identifying support and engaging with the communities that will be affected by this change. We have a section that talks about funding options, which generally speaking are either federal, state, local, or private. And then thinking about what supportive policies can encourage the deployment of separated bike lanes. And in particular, it's those policies that really do put safety first that tend to support the implementation and deployment of separated bike lanes. Again, drawing back to the fact that we now know without any question, we now know with certainty that separated bike lanes do improve safety. And if safety is your top priority in the context of high-speed roads, it is the recommended design to provide that safety. Sorry, separated bike lanes or shared use paths. Moving into design, the guide goes through some of the most common design vertical elements to provide that separation. I'm skipping into certain topics that, not exhaustively covering the content of the toolkit guide, but one thing that we get a lot of questions about is the question of vertical separation. So broadly speaking, we have available to us the same types of vertical separation elements on high-speed roads that are being used in separated bike lane applications everywhere in all contexts. This first slide details some of those less sturdy, less crash-worthy elements. So delineator posts, parking stops, or using parked cars. These are all being used on high-speed roads with some degree of success. We didn't find any evidence that says that these should not be used or cannot be used. However, there are some caveats with their application. Things like delineator posts and parking stops are less durable. They don't provide crash protection, and they will likely experience a high degree of attrition over time as they are, worn down through inaccurate driving behavior. However, they are inexpensive and can be deployed quickly, and may be a good interim step as we build up momentum for a more a longer term, more durable solution. Parked cars do provide a sense of greater protection and are more durable, a barrier, not to mention they are wider than the first two types. The challenge on higher speed roads is that it's less common to have on-street parking, and that where on-street parking exists, it tends to be less utilized. Now, this is likely for a number of reasons, a lot to do with land use as well as driver comfort. So if there is a context where on a high-speed road parking is prevalent, it could be worth considering parked cars as your barrier, though I think those conditions are likely to be relatively rare. The next set of vertical separation elements are those more sturdy ones. So using barriers provides a very high level of crash protection, tend to last for a long time, not requiring a lot of maintenance, and are relatively easy to install. They have less impacts on stormwater management. They can be deployed relatively quickly and don't require a full reconstruction of the street. Moving up, the next type of separation is a raised median curb. So this is the type of design where the bike lane remains at street level, but a raised curb is built in between the traffic space and the bicycling space. These do require street construction and can affect the stormwater management system. The photo on the screen here shows an example of an application where the stormwater continued to flow as originally designed, though sometimes there are some workarounds needed. Higher investment upfront, but longer lasting and likely to be supported in the communities. Just more attractive to look at. And then finally, raised bike lane, which is a bike lane that is at sidewalk level, does provide a high level of comfort and separation from traffic. It is appropriate and a good idea, can be a good idea on streets with higher speeds. However, there are ongoing concerns with disability compatibility, and the research is continuing to evolve, including another project being led by Darren Buck on how we can design these types of treatments that are detectable to visually impaired pedestrians and provide the same level of separation and comfort. These can be expensive. They require a lot of space. We need to make sure there's enough space on the sidewalk for people walking, as well as separate space for people biking, and then the street. If the sidewalk is being widened for this application, then of course we're going to have to rebuild the drainage system. So a few examples to get people's brains thinking about this topic. So when thinking about the types of vertical separation needed, we want to think about, first of all, the fact is that the horizontal and vertical separation are essential on higher speed roads. And in some cases, the horizontal separation can be as important. People on bikes feel more comfortable when they're further offset from vehicles. And it's also possible to use separation types in combination to get the full benefits of several treatments at an overall lower cost. although I'll say again, one of the most effective strategies to improve safety and comfort is to reduce the speed of vehicles. So this toolkit guide is focused primarily on how to design separated bike lanes on these higher speed contexts, but I want to make sure I say that from the stakeholder committee and from the peer exchange, there's a strong consensus that the better practice, the more robust way to achieve these safety gains is to reduce the frequency of the need for higher speed streets. So just to run through these key considerations quickly, none of these probably come as a surprise. The cost of separated bike lanes can vary significantly depending on what separation type you choose. Perception of safety can vary. People riding bikes feel more safe with permanent build-outs with rigid elements such as bollards, a raised curb, or a median. Durability is an important consideration. Although affordable materials can reduce the costs incurred upfront, the separators may not be as durable, and over the long term, it may be worth investing in the more durable designs early on. In terms of maintenance, people riding bikes on higher speed roads may not be able to exit the bike lane, as I mentioned, to avoid debris, roadkill, poor maintenance conditions, or lane closures. We need to consider the impacts of stormwater management when selecting a separation type, especially on higher speed roads where ponding might create a safety risk to drivers in adjacent lanes. The risk for run off the road crashes exists everywhere, of course, and is especially a threat to vulnerable road users. However, on higher speed roads with cars moving at a higher velocity, that risk is greater. So we want to find a balance between managing that risk and also protecting the safety of people driving. So we need to recognize that rigid point objects like bollards, concrete bollards, may be perceived as safer for people riding bikes, but they would potentially increase the severity of fixed object crashes for drivers. Aesthetics is often a consideration for people designing and implementing these facilities, especially for your communities. And the most separation types for higher speed roads can be designed either aesthetically or non-aesthetically with these other considerations in mind. Resurfacing projects are a good opportunity to efficiently install separated bike lanes, but however, the construction effort varies by separator type. Moving on to width, the greater horizontal separation, as I said before, in conjunction with vertical separation elements, provide the greatest comfort for people biking on high-speed roads. And finally, vehicle speeds can be reduced through design, such as narrowing the travel lanes, adding a wider bike facility, adding on-street parking, and reducing the number of travel lanes. Moving on, thinking about intersections and driveways, there are 5 key considerations here. Improving access management will minimize bicycle vehicle conflicts overall, and in general, we should strive to make crossings on higher speed roads as short and infrequent as possible, and the vertical separation, the vertical protection, should extend as close to the conflict point as possible. Consideration about one-way versus two-way bike lanes, maintaining visibility. Two-way bike lanes can provide more direct access and save some of the cross-section dimension needed, but they can also cause issues at driveways and intersections as from a driver expectation perspective, where drivers may not be expecting people coming from the same direction or the opposite direction, depending on what turning movement is. These can be addressed with signal design or restricting vehicle movements. Maintaining adequate sight distance and visibility at crossings is critically important, and these requirements are longer. They require more distance at higher speeds. So we need to be thinking about that in the design process. The design should communicate that bicyclists have the right of way and they need to delineate the bicycle lane through the intersection. And then I have, for the last two, I have a slide each to provide some more context. In general, mixing zones are not recommended on higher speed roads due to fast moving vehicles entering the mixing zone where in a place where there's no protection for bicyclists. If it is necessary to provide a mixing zone, or sorry, to do a mixing zone, then the design should provide an extended deceleration lane for vehicles ahead of the mixing zone. Get the vehicles slowed down, separated from bikes, and then when we get to the point where mixing must happen, drivers are going at a slower speed. And then finally, thinking about signalized intersections, separate traffic signals should be considered for people biking, people driving. Left turns should be restricted or controlled with protected phasing to the extent possible. And we're seeing in high-speed contexts that the design principles of the protected intersection treatment tend to reinforce the behavior that we want to see from all users. These designs, in addition to providing that signalized separation, include treatments to reduce vehicle turning speeds with the curb islands or turn wedges, etc. Finally, moving on to maintenance, we want to plan and budget from the outset for how a separated bike lane will be maintained. It's important to consider the width of the facility and evaluate the agency's equipment for sweeping and plowing. We need to establish partnerships with stakeholders and develop clear maintenance plans from the outset. This includes coordination with public agencies on asset management, regular maintenance needs, and construction closures. And then finally, as I said before, consider stormwater management needs in the design process. Seasonal maintenance will vary for different geographic regions, of course. In many cases, agencies have needed to purchase new snow removal equipment that's specifically sized to work in the bike facilities that they operate. And included in this consideration is to identify the appropriate applications for de-icing and then also providing storage space for snow removal, separate from the sidewalk, the bicycling area, and the street. So to wrap up the discussion of the toolkit guide, the guide builds on the existing research and guidance provided in the FHWA separated bike lane planning and design guide. When planning a bike facility on higher speed roads, there must be separation between people biking and vehicles. There is not appropriate in these contexts to have shared lanes or other bike facilities without separation. So to close with this, I wanted to remind some of the three key questions that we see from the research. That is, first, what form of separation is needed on a higher speed road? As I said, vertical separation is essential. Horizontal separation can be as important. And people biking feel more comfortable when further offset from vehicles. Rigid barriers are better, but need to be selected and designed appropriately for higher speed roadways. Separation types can be used in combination to realize the full benefit of several treatments at a lower overall cost. Thinking again about the question of maintenance, we want to improve access management to minimize, sorry, not maintenance. Improve access management and sorry. I just covered the topics of maintenance. Separated bike lanes the maintenance of separated bike lanes should be thought of from the outset as they're being planned and designed, and considering all seasons and in terms of clearing, as well as how the barriers and separation elements will be held up. Finally, how can agencies sustain safe separated bike lane operations on high speeds? By planning and budgeting for how separated bike lanes, by reducing the incidence of access points, improving access management to minimize bicycle vehicle conflicts, that crossings on higher speed roads should be short and infrequent, with vertical protection extended for as long as possible. Mixing zones should be avoided, as they would force bicyclists and fast-moving motor vehicle traffic to share space. If necessary, it is recommended to provide the deceleration lane outside of the mixing zone area. And then finally, using separated traffic signals to separate the movements of conflicting bicyclists and vehicles. So to close, I just want to share a couple of examples of separated bike lanes and applications at higher speed roads. The first is Slaughter Lane in Austin, Texas. Slaughter Lane is a major arterial located in suburban South Austin. It provides access to residences and businesses, as well as people commuting through the corridor. In 2018, Austin completed a corridor mobility study for the entire Slaughter Lane corridor, which spans 10 miles and has 56 intersections. Since the beginning of 2019, Vision Zero data has reported 17 traffic crashes on the 4-mile segment that's focused in this case study, including 6 pedestrian or bicycle crashes, 5 of which were serious injury and 1 was fatal. The corridor also includes segments of the bicycle, motorcycle, motor vehicle, and pedestrian high injury network. Construction was funded in 2016 and began in 2021. Once completed, the one-way separated bike lanes on both sides of Slaughter Lane stretched for nearly 4 miles. The adjacent roadway is marked at 45 miles per hour. It has 4 to 6 lanes of traffic and average daily vehicle traffic of 38,000 vehicles per day. And a couple of lessons that came out of from our colleagues in Austin, that early in the installation process, there was a lot of media coverage of drivers veering into the curb element and blowing their tires. And there was some sensational local news coverage, as you can probably imagine. And that resulted in the city revising the curb profile to add a smoother side profile and tapered front end to reduce the impact of vehicle tires from drivers who couldn't stop driving into the curb. They also reduced the profile from 6 inches to 5 inches on that they use on lower speed contexts. And the city may still come back and add thermoplastic paint at the ends to increase visibility even further. The other example comes from Pomona, California. This is a 2-way separated bike lane on Valley Boulevard. It's the first protected bike facility in Pomona and extends about 1.5 miles, providing connections between Pomona's neighborhoods and educational facilities, including Cal Poly Pomona. The separated bike lane here was part of Pomona's larger resurfacing effort to add about 10 miles of bike lanes on 4 other streets. And it was funded by an active transportation grant from Metro and a combination of state sales and gas taxes. They included partnership with Cal Poly Pomona, the Unified School District, and high school. As you can see in the photo, the corridor, the design has a mostly continuous raised curb, and they selected this treatment because there are relatively few driveways on the southern side of Valley Boulevard. And they've got openings for the few driveways and bus stop. And then at bus stops, they have islands. So again, another 45-mile-per-hour street with full separation and resulting in a new safe connection for people biking. The guide includes a handful of additional case studies with more information, as I know that can often be an important selling point as we try to advance these designs in our own communities. So with that, I will wrap up and we can begin the question and answer portions.
Great. Thank you, Connor, and all of our panelists for sharing your presentations. We did get quite a few questions from everybody. People are very interested in this topic. So I want to see if we can shift to a Q&A period and get through and address as many of these as we can, with the understanding that, we didn't, within these studies, I don't think explore every single issue that is relevant for applying separated bike lanes. A lot of people asking about violations or people are parking in separated bike lanes and how to keep that from happening. I don't know that we necessarily touched on a lot of that in these studies, certainly important issues, but I did want to kind of circle back and start with Karen, your presentation on the CMFs. Really impressive, and very glad to have those as part of our toolbox now. Few questions, and these may be things that you covered, but it's worth revisiting because we've got a lot of questions on them. Were the CMFs that you developed for total crashes or total bicyclist crashes, or do they get as specific as the fatal and serious injury crash types addressed? Could you speak to that and maybe how broad the CMFs are to be applied?
They were for total bicycle related crashes, and that's a characteristic of the database. We looked at separating injury from non-injury crashes, and unfortunately, almost all bicycle to motor vehicle crashes are injury crashes, and so that didn't really give us a large enough sample size to statistically be able to evaluate it.
Okay, I see. And one other thing, maybe I'm sure you covered this, if you could remind us, because it relates to a question I want to ask Connor, is within your study, could you tell us again what were the specific types or configurations of separated bike lanes that were assessed? Was it everything from one-way separated to two-way separated, sidewalk level to flex post, everything under the sun, or did you have a specific type of separated bike lane that you were looking at and used in the study?
Our larger database included all of the things you just mentioned, because literally we had them viewing the street view and driving down these streets, and every time they came to an element, including driveways, we noted it. But ultimately, when we went to develop the models, our goal, of course, was to be able to compare separate bicycle lanes to traditional bicycle lanes. That was our primary goal. So when we went to do that, the sample size for things like two-way bicycle lanes was quite small. And so there are ways that you can include some variables in a model by giving them some sort of a categorical variable, but we had such pretty complex models already that we decided we would try and make it as straightforward as we could. So the separate bicycle lanes were one directional. They were located on the right edge of the road. They had flexi posts or transitions, from flexi posts to other separate bicycle treatments. So they were pretty much the standard type of separated bicycle lane that we were talking about. There are all sorts of different configurations you could consider. I hope that ultimately those do get considered, but right now I think we're a little limited because we're still building like crazy, which I think was a great decision because obviously they are proving to be safe. But maybe a few more years and we'll be able to expand the population to those other characteristics.
Great. Thank you. And Connor, I wanted to shift on that same topic to the toolkit guide and some of the recommendations there. We got a lot of questions about recommended widths for certain types of bicycle lanes, the buffers, separated bike lanes, the buffers between them, one-way versus two-way. And that guidance is all available and available to folks in typical settings, but wanted to ask generally if within the context of the toolkit guide and the work that was done on that, do we see those recommendations or potential for those changing as you get into these higher speed settings? The question being primarily the buffer width, and in a lot of cases, it may have to do with the type of vertical element you're using. But I wonder if you could just speak generally about that issue and maybe what to think about as you're moving to that high speed setting.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think, again, the number of applications of separated bike lanes on high speed roads in the US is pretty small. In fact, in the world is pretty small. And so we don't have concrete evidence to say this over this. But as I said during the presentation, we know that at higher speed, cyclists are looking for more horizontal separation from traffic. And so that buffer width is an important consideration, and we want to err on the higher side than we would on other contexts. Sort of the same approach, I would say, to the consideration of one-way versus two-way. We have these guiding principles for deciding about where a two-way facility can be appropriate, right? If there's relatively fewer driveways, relatively few cross streets, then it may make sense to put the separated bike lane on one side of the street. That is just, I think, amped up on higher speeds. You want even less frequent crossings, and those crossings need to be more managed than at lower speeds because of the potential for crash risk.
That makes sense. And I want to build on that and remind folks, if we circle back to this, got this question a lot, and you defined it early on, but could you say one more time how we're defining higher speed in the context of this guide? I think that point was made a few times, but I just want to make sure it's clear to everybody.
for the purpose of the toolkit guide, we focused on streets at 40 miles per hour and faster. There is a lot of cases at 35 miles per hour, and 35 miles per hour is speed at which the separation is needed. And so we had some debate among the project team and the research team with FHWA about where to make that cutoff. And ultimately we decided on 40 miles per hour, not because that's where their application is more needed, but because that's where the design, the severity of the velocity of vehicles is significantly different from where we've seen on most of our streets.
Sure. And the point was brought up several times by some comments and questions that whether the posted speed is really the deciding factor in some of these cases, or whether people should be considering their operating speed, and bringing up a lot of cases where the roadway may be marked 30, 35 miles per hour, but people are pretty sure, and maybe sure based on speed studies, that vehicles are traveling closer to that 40 and above range. Did the toolkit guide get into some of those scenarios where maybe further investigation might be needed?
Absolutely, yeah. The guidance is actually written, if you don't know your operating speed, then you can use posted speed, but the design should be designed based on operating speed.
And to come back, Karen, to your study, it's a good point for us to clarify that though Connor was presenting on higher speed settings, I'm under the impression, and I think from your findings, that the study sites that you looked at were not necessarily in higher speed conditions. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
Was there a typical breakdown within your study sites of the speed limits along those corridors that were maybe more common? I imagine it was a range. I don't know if they were all exactly the same.
Yeah, we collected it, and it ranged from 25 up to about 35. So it was pretty much what you would think for common central business district type environments where you're commonly seeing these separate bicycle lanes, pop up.
One of the questions that came up was whether and Connor had mentioned in some of the research we've seen, the presence of the separated bike lane may have effects on vehicle speeds. People are asking if that might have had any impact in the findings in your study after the separated bike lane is introduced, the vehicle speeds may be lower, and that could contribute to increased safety, even if it's not necessarily the collisions between the road users, just that decreases in safety or speeds among the motor vehicles. I don't imagine that was a direct takeaway from your research study, but is it worth speculating on maybe future studies on looking at that issue?
Yeah, there's always surrogate characteristics that you might think contributed. That certainly seems to be one. I mean, I know if I were a cyclist and I was trying to decide between a facility that had a separate bicycle lane, a facility that had no bicycle lane, or a simple traditional bicycle lane, I would lend myself towards going over to the separate bicycle lane, and so the volume probably would peak with bicycles there, and I would think motor vehicles would be responsive to that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a reasonable surrogate to assume that would happen, but it's not something that's was very measurable for us to be able to evaluate.
Okay, I see. And then, sorry, if this is probably something else that you mentioned, the specific to the vertical element along the separated bike lanes. Was there any consistency with the type of vertical element on the sites that you studied, or was it a range again of flex posts or raised curbs, things like that?
There's consistency within a jurisdiction,
Okay.
because they chose, say, flexi posts for all of their separate bicycle lanes. Between jurisdictions, you saw a variety. In some places, for example, using the parked car as separated as a vertical element, some places said they wouldn't even consider using that because the parked car may not be there 24 hours a day. Others said that's a perfectly acceptable treatment. So we collected it. Whether or not there was cars parked there parallel to the facility and separating them. Ultimately, it was just a small sample and we didn't include it. So we have a variety of those that we acquired but didn't pan out for the analysis. So ultimately, we primarily had flexi posts and then some sort of transition to other types of treatments.
I see. Along the same lines, Connor, speaking of vertical elements, obviously a lot of interest, and there was attention paid to this in the toolkit guide about what is the most appropriate type of vertical element to use in a higher speed setting, and several questions specific to the point of whether these need to be crash worthy elements, and to what degree that needs to be a consideration when kind of moving forward with the implementation of these projects.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we tried to untangle through the research. This is a research study on an early versioning design, so we don't have, again, concrete evidence to tell a clear answer. But we know that at higher speeds, there is a greater severity threat to people on bikes. And if the barrier element can be driven through without any obstruction, that threat exists to the person biking. Still, the prevailing, the evidence from those projects that have been installed is that the separation element does reduce the chance of that happening. So at higher speeds, I would say we want to move toward a more durable, crash-worthy design, even if it's just a curb to deflect vehicles back away from the course of the cyclist. But at a minimum, any kind of separation does provide that additional. It does have an additional benefit.
One other question, Connor, that we've been receiving is this: the question of context in terms of applying some of these treatments on separated bike lanes. And as you said, the examples on higher speed roads are limited of them that are actually on the ground. There's speculation among the folks in the audience that these still seem to be, the examples shown still seem to be denser urban environments where these are being used, and that those are the ones we kind of looked at. My impression from being involved in the study a bit is that some of these locations, though they are in cities, they are in more maybe what I consider suburban context. We didn't really touch on, it didn't seem too many of the rural applications. So I wonder if you could speak to how the toolkit guide could be used in all of these types of applications. Is it maybe more appropriate for one type of setting than another, or do you see broad application depending on wherever you are? It could be kind of used to inform the types of projects.
That's another good question. And yeah, true. We did not have any, I don't think we had any rural case studies in the guide. There was an example or two across a long bridge, which is a little bit like a rural context. There's no land uses anyway, but what I didn't say this maybe explicitly already, but we eliminated from our research the condition of a shared use path. And my instinct is that design might be well suited in contexts where there's not going to be high numbers of people walking and biking, and achieves a lot of the same benefits that we expect from the shared use path. I'm sorry, from the separated bike lane, with the caveats that come along with maintenance and intersection and conflict point designs. Like they need to be considered as actively for shared use path designs as you do with separated bike lane. I think that's a lot of times where our existing designs fall short. So if I were trying to apply this in a rural context, I don't think there's any reason not to consider, sorry for the double negative, I think you could consider a separated bike lane, though it may be just as well to go with a shared use path design.
Okay, I see. Karen, I wanted to get back to your CMF study. There's a speculation or comments in the chat about the crashes after installation of a separated bike lane. May see reductions in crashes, but those that are still existing, people speculate that those are happening then at the intersections where the separation is not present. And I wonder, within the context of your study, if you could unpack the process a little bit more in the methodology. Did the crashes that were include everything up and down the corridor, independent of whether it occurred at an intersection, or were you specifically looking at reductions in crashes along the segment away from intersections that were maybe more specifically addressed through the presence of the separated bike lane?
So the models we developed are we call them mid-block models, but they actually go all the way up to the intersection edge. And what I'm going to call the intersection edge is we kind of use highway safety manual definitions for that. So basically 250 feet from the center line to center line crossing. But we also created, we then took the remaining intersection crashes. And by the way, intersection related crashes are the things that we're interested in. And in some cases, we had intersection crashes that were not coded as intersection related. The subtlety is that intersection related crashes mean that maybe it's angle crash or something that, is going to happen at an intersection, but you could have a crash that's occurring in the physical intersection that's not related, an intersection related crash. That could be someone who falls asleep, runs off the road and hits something, that we're going to have that type of crash everywhere. So we use kind of the same approach that they do in HSM to try and identify what were considered mid-block crashes, which would be non-intersection crashes and intersection crashes. I think that, taking a look at the crash definition is important, and considering what the intersection looks like. Once again, we tried to develop intersection models and they didn't pan out. I speculated one of those might have been, when I started looking at the data, it seemed like the intersection related crashes didn't quite land in the location that I expected them to. So it could be the reporting, how a particular jurisdiction reports the intersection location or the crash location. Sometimes you'll see that. So, obviously that's something that we're sensitive to, but, you only have the crash data to, you have to take it at its word and assume that it's correct. That's what we had to do.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I wanted to keep it with you for a bit more of a technical research question, maybe a peek under the hood of the methodology in your study. There's a really interesting question asking what surrogate data you think is most important for estimating your AADB or your daily bicycle exposure model in your opinion, and maybe for research going forward, and whether you considered any app data like Strava or other observed data that could help in your exposure models for the researchers in the room.
When we developed the exposure models, it was a little bit before some of the crowdsourcing data was readily available. So we didn't use that for the exposure models at the time. So what we had to do is assume surrogates. And so we went to take a look at the influence that, the Pearson's correlation will give you a good indication about whether or not something is related to the actual crash condition. And so we looked at correlation characteristics to try and identify exposure characteristics. And also we looked at ADT, the regional ADT, and we looked at this is another case where that proximity to other bicycle facilities came into play. So we looked at those types of characteristics to try and get the exposure. And the proximity to other bicycle characteristics ended up being an important element when we looked at exposure models. I will say that we have more work to be done on our bicycle exposure models. Ideally, I wish that every city would put up bicycle counters and leave them out there. We have those for cars. I think it's probably just as important to have them for bicycles. And I think that's the direction a lot of cities are going. And that will even improve the exposure models if we could get them to follow that path.
Thank you for that. Connor, back to you. I saw a few questions referencing the vehicles themselves that may be involved in crashes, and everyone seems to be aware of these studies that are coming out about the increasing vehicle size and mass, and that being a major contributor to some of the more severe outcomes involved in these crashes. And speculation is that on a higher speed road, maybe it's a bigger highway, arterial street, different than a local road, and it may be carrying sort of a different mix of vehicle types. I don't think we can say that we really went into great detail on the vehicle characteristics or the traffic characteristics in terms of vehicle size. But is that an issue that you've heard elsewhere, or is that a consideration for folks in terms of when they're designing, thinking about what motor vehicles are using the adjacent space near bicyclists? Yeah,
only anecdotally I can say. I think fundamentally the principles remain the same. As I take this opportunity to say again, the best treatment on high-speed roads is to lower speeds. So start there, and that will affect all size vehicles equally. But still, right, the mass of the larger vehicle is going to carry more force than the smaller vehicle. So thinking about your horizontal separation is important. Thinking about the barrier type is important. If I knew I had a street or a community that had a higher prevalence of larger mass vehicles, I would err on the side of more crash worthiness in my barriers.
I see. And keeping it with you, Connor, and a more broad question maybe is, there's comments that the higher speed roads and these really difficult roads to provide safe facilities for bicyclists are oftentimes state-owned roads in many cases, and the local agencies to make these improvements are having to work collectively with the state. And I don't know if that came up in speaking with some of our case study communities or the steering panel committee.
Yeah, I mean,
could you speak about any of those kind of like the relationship that's needed between the state and the local agency to really come to these solutions?
yeah, of course. I think, I mentioned up at the top that we had 5 state DOTs on our stakeholder committee. There is unquestionably interest from states in advancing this design. Every state DOT I've ever worked in says that safety is their #1 priority, and this is a known safety treatment that I think, especially as state roads, they may have higher speeds, but they also tend to have more space. It can be more feasible to design. I'm generalizing, but it can be more feasible to design these fully separated facilities in those contexts. And then we had a 6th state DOT, Michigan, participate in the peer exchange. There are while the interest and capabilities of states vary, of course, there's no reason to think that a state DOT should be a barrier. It should be a barrier to designing these treatments. In fact, I think it's likely that they will over time become a strong proponent of this design.
Thank you. And to build off of that just a bit more, to what degree do you think to help this kind of move in that direction, do you think that these principles maybe need to be applied or incorporated into state DOTs design manuals or guidance to offer that? Because when we scanned, several mini state DOT manuals, and there wasn't an exact recommendation for these types of settings. It could probably because there's little research being done and actual examples, but that seems to be an important factor. Is once it is a sort of a acknowledged and placed into a DOT's design manual recommendations, then that can move the process forward in terms of actually putting these down on the ground.
Yeah, well, I think credit to Federal Highway, who is greatly trusted among state DOT engineers. They have the bikeway selection guide, which recommends separated bike lanes in this context. There is this toolkit guide that will be published shortly that recommends this bike lane and this design in this context. The AASHTO bike guide, whenever it comes out, will, I anticipate, make the same recommendation. So all of the most critical, Darren's going to jump in here, all the most critical agent guidance documents from the federal level and the national level are pointing in this direction. And I don't see why states wouldn't follow suit.
Yeah, Connor hit a few themes, and I'll just add to that many of the challenges that are identified in general in implementing separated bike lanes in these contexts are oftentimes the ones that state DOTs are sort of struggling with. They may be subject to state statutes governing maintenance or construction of certain types of projects, and being able to reconcile those with the implementation of, say, a separated bike lane that poses some unique maintenance upkeep challenges. Those are known barriers. So through our Complete Streets initiative, we are sort of trying to confront sort of larger issues of policy, of statute, of implementation that may be standing in the way of state DOTs being able to work on their own roadways or in cooperation with locals to implement these types of designs. So it is not solely a design problem, and it's I think every bit of evidence, however, that we're able to turn up as Karen's team has been able to do helps us at least advance and gives us the impetus to keep confronting the very real issues that do hinder implementation.
And Darren, you're back for I think the most frequently asked question we got during the webinar. Hopefully you can answer this one. People want to know when they might be expecting to see the toolkit guide and be able to start using that. If you have any speculation or could offer a time.
I hesitate to speculate. We do have a draft from the team. We've had a number of staffing issues within Federal Highway. We're working hard on bill implementation. I was just in a meeting earlier today, so we are working on sort of getting a review of that guide and getting it out on the street. And I won't speak for my Turner Fairbanks colleagues on the full technical brief of Karen's project, but that is also one where there is a full technical report on that resource that will be forthcoming, and we are working hard on it.
Thank you. We'll look forward to it. We look forward to digging into the details of the CMF study as well. And thank you all so much. I want to thank our panel, Connor Simler, Darren Buck, and Karen Dixon for sharing their work today. I just shared a link in the chat where you can go provide some feedback to us on the webinar today and get a certificate of attendance for joining us today. This is going to come to you by email tomorrow as well. So if you miss it or can't do it now, you'll have an opportunity. Thank you again for attending. We enjoyed spending time with you today, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dan.